Okay, thank you very much indeed. Hello, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak. And before we get going, I'd just like to acknowledge that this is a real team effort. The work that I'm going to talk about here is from a much wider interdisciplinary team. We've got psychologists involved, we have a neuroscientist involved, statistician, network scientists, and also computer scientists have all come together in the work that I'm going to present here. So to begin with, I thought it'd be just worth pausing for a moment and thinking back as to where we've come from with regard to the smartphone, and just stopping for a moment and thinking a little bit more about what's happened over a relatively short period of time. So we were only really talking about a couple of decades here. So, you know, we started out with the brick, the first generation analog technology that wasn't mass used, and then we've seen the switch to digital second generation and text messaging through to third generation, where we start to interact with the internet, and fourth generation, where we get higher data rates and we can sustain multimedia, so on and so forth. So over a rapid period of time, we've seen an awful lot of change in terms of these, of the functionality of these devices. And the impact on human behavior is absolutely profound, and we just now take this for granted, but you see pictures like this almost everywhere. That could have been the train that I arrived on this morning. People were just there absorbing, interacting with their smartphones, just totally consumed. It's really interesting. So we've suddenly developed habits, behaviors, rituals around smartphone usage that we seem to synchronize with as human beings, as a species, really, really well. And I think that's really fascinating. And to some extent, what we're seeing here is the technology synchronizing in a really deep way with our brain. So we kind of starting to use the technology as a crutch, a cognitive support. We can start to use it to help us with memory, location awareness, social relationships. We can surf and compare others, so on and so forth. So we have this really kind of intimate relationship. To the extent that it could be referred to as a kind of extended mind. And I just wanted to reference here a really interesting paper by philosophers, Clark and Chalmers. It certainly predated the sort of mass smartphone usage that we see today, where they were talking about how humans are just really well disposed to taking objects around them and using them to help with their thinking, their cognition. And in the paper in 1998, it was just a pad and paper that was being used as an exemplar. But it's probably fair to say the smartphone is now really the true exemplar of this concept of the extended mind. And through all this usage, you know, we're building up a really significant footprint, whether we like it or not, in terms of the digital signature going forward. So that might just be around us as an individual and our usage. It can be with two-way interactions, who we interact with. We can also start to release it into the wild as well. We can start to consider what happens under mass usage and also potentially try and harness this in new ways to provide new insights to problems. So I just wanted to present this really as a perspective to just to bring together thoughts and motivations for some of our work as a group at Cardiff. And in particular, I'd like to just present two different areas that we've worked on over a 5-year period now. The first area being an in the wild study, a study where we invite participation from as many people as possible. And secondly, a study that's much more controlled, where we're interested in understanding the interaction with the smartphone at a much more granular level. So I'll begin just by looking at the personality work that we've done in terms of location. So back in 2014, 2015, you may recall an app called Foursquare being quite popular. I think Foursquare's moved on now to change its business model slightly, but I believe it was responsible for starting the revolution that we saw, where we could start to check in. We could kind of register our presence at a particular location through a check-in, and others have followed suit since then. But it really was kind of the first main contender in this kind of area. And so what this did for the first time was provide a sort of street-level map for users, either to just record themselves or share with others, which was sort of quite fascinating. And also Foursquare made available at the time an API that allowed some restricted but useful access to its own data for developers and others. So we decided that we would harness Foursquare, and in particular Foursquare users, to investigate or attempt to investigate whether we could make any insights or inferences from the disposition of people using Foursquare through to what those users might do in the real world at street level. And this was kind of our first major in the wild study. And the element that we decided to focus on, because it was well known and well studied, was human personality. So our disposition as members of the human race, we can, roughly speaking, kind of map that to 5 dimensions, the ocean model. So we all have an element of openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And these individual differences vary amongst the population. And we began to wonder whether they had an impact on how humans might start to behave at the street level. So using, kindly funded by the European Commission 7th Framework Programme, we were fortunate enough to gain funding to allow us to explore this further. So we set up an online experiment that kind of went into a deal with Foursquare users, a very transparent and open deal with participants, where we'd invite Foursquare users to undertake a personality assessment, so a questionnaire. It's quite a few questions to go through, but it's something that can easily be done in a few minutes, so 44 simple questions to answer. And alongside that, we invited the participants to sign into Foursquare. So we didn't handle, we weren't exposed to their credentials. We allowed the Foursquare API to take their credentials, and through the API, we were able to have a look at the Foursquare data of the individual. We didn't take any details of the individual whatsoever, other than being able to observe their Foursquare activity. So on the back of this, we were able to then, just in a couple of minutes, provide that individual taking the survey with a map of their locations that they'd visited, and also to provide them with a personality assessment. So they could go to particular locations on the map, look at their own personality, and kind of compare it with an average personality for people visiting that particular venue. And if we didn't have enough data, then we put up there just an overall average from the population. So we provided some interactive incentive for individuals to interact with us around personality. So we were pleased when we didn't quite know how this would be received by Foursquare users, but we had a reasonable number, actually, 174 participants, and we were able to assess just under 500,000 check-ins, 478,000, I think the exact figure was. But it was quite interesting, just from that 174 users, just how much of the globe we were starting to cover with check-ins. So we were aware that we were attracting perhaps the expert end of the Foursquare user community. So this allowed us then to go forward and to have a look at correlations. So to what extent are there signals there that relate an individual facet from personality to street-level behaviour? It's quite interesting. We pulled out three findings. Firstly, around openness, in that there's a positive correlation between open participants and the distance between the venues that they visited. So the venues for open people tended to be further spread out. And also there was correlation with popular venues and sociable venues as well. So places that are highly popular and places that were generally, like restaurants or bars, quite sociable places. Also for neuroticism, there was a negative correlation there with the number of venues visited. So highly neurotic individuals tended to have a reduced number of venues visited, and those venues also tended not to be sociable. And finally, conscientiousness. Conscientiousness was correlated with overall location-based social network usage. So the act of actually checking into places requires a level of discipline, or it certainly did in the way that the app was configured then. So we had conscientious people being strong users, in effect. So these were really interesting findings, and we really, at the beginning of this study, due to the sort of a lack of people moving into this space, we just did not know the extent to which potentially noisy signals might correlate with personality disposition. So the big caveat here is it is a very noisy study. It is an in the wild study. We didn't select the population that we had as participants, so on and so forth. But we moved forward with this study effectively as a kind of early proof of concept. We also went on to look at the potential for attraction between similar individuals as well. So the question that we were looking at, this is a kind of a birds of feather flock together kind of question. So do people of a certain personality type have a propensity to find locations that are somehow similar in terms of common check-ins? So we were able to build a network representation of this. I'll skip over some of the details. Details are well recorded in the papers that we've published on this area. But what we were able to do again is pull out some quite interesting findings on correlations between conscientiousness, openness, and agreeableness, and having those traits increase the propensity for those individuals to check in at the same locations. So that was quite interesting, and we came across quite an interesting finding around disagreeable. There we are. Around disagreeable individuals, which haven't, in the personality literature, kind of get forgotten a little bit. But we found that disagreeable individuals had a propensity, or there was a correlation that showed that they were more likely to check in at similar places. And so it led us to start thinking whether disagreeability or disagreeableness might be effectively a process of selectivity. So people who are disagreeable might just be that bit more picky or selective on where they go, and also relate that to recommendations from others. So overall, we found that sort of extending in this direction to location-based social networks created some new and interesting findings beyond online social network behavior, which has been reasonably well studied in terms of personality. Okay. So for the final part of the talk, what I'm going to talk about is our interaction with smartphones at a device level. So this is at the other end of the spectrum of an in the wild study. This is a type of study that we set up that was very much controlled. And it centers around work that we've had supported by the Wellcome Trust around an app that we've developed called Tymer. And Tymer is an app that sits on the smartphone, and it allows us to understand the interactions that an individual has with that smartphone on a daily basis. And our aim in introducing the app was to monitor what the individual does on a daily basis with the smartphone, but also open up a communication channel to that individual where they could give us some feedback on their mood and how they're feeling at particular points in the day. So this schema here gives a kind of a portrait of the experimental design. So we had a cohort of 67 participants. So this was a small study. We recruited 67 participants at Cardiff University, a mixture of staff and students that were recruited out of term time. So these were a mixture of students and staff ranging from around 18 through to mid to late 40s, I think. So a reasonable spread, and we had a near even gender split as well. And the study was designed in such a way as to give each participant the Tymer app for an 8-week period. And at the beginning of that 8-week period, we had a briefing session where people were told how to interpret the app, and were told about the study, and they underwent user surveys so that we could gain more information about the sample. And the surveys constituted a whole range of different aspects. But we had in there personality, smartphone addiction level, which was an interesting one, impulsivity, other assessments as well. And we designed the study with the surveys at the beginning and at the end, at the debrief session, so that we could just do a check on the consistency of our assessments before and after. So with the app on the phone, we were collecting, we weren't just looking at time that people were spending on the phone, we were looking at the interaction, so physical touches of the screen, so taps, scrolling, etc., etc. So a very granular level that's sort of well suited to sort of a computer scientist approach. And at the same time, we were able to poll individuals to report their mood state as well. So this is just a snapshot of how the app, the interface looked. So we had morning and evening surveys for mood, and we could request a mood survey at any point during the day as well. And the app was prompting people for feedback, but it was also listening as well. It was listening for scroll events, taps, pressing the screen, app switching. It was also listening for screen off events, screen on events, unlock, so on and so forth. So reasonably low-level changes of state on the device. Those were recorded locally on the individual phones, and then once a day that was parceled up and sent off to our server. And because of the way in which iOS is kind of heavily locked down, we were accomplishing this using Android, but we have 4 little people at the bottom here just to remind me of what a struggle that actually was for our lead software engineer, Liam Turner, because Android has many different flavors. There are many people using different types of Android phones, and manufacturers, we found, had gone in and wanted to suppress background activity to prolong the length of life of individual smartphones. So there was a lot of tweaking and testing and tweaking and retesting in order to make sure that we had a stable app that we had confidence in. So just to give you a flavor of the intensity of usage, we had an average of 97 sessions per day. So that's a session is just a period, a contiguous period on the device. And usage was just over 4 hours per day on average. And that's not inconsistent with other studies out there. And we had very high variability around session length. So the average worked out at just a couple of minutes, but a very high standard deviation in terms of session length. And the reason for session length being quite variable is actually quite interesting, because if we just stand back for a moment and think about how smartphones have evolved, it's very much the case that we're using them as proxy for other devices. So GPS in the car, people watch Netflix on the device, movies, et cetera, et cetera. So the device can be used in so many different ways that sometimes it may trip into these kind of ways of use that are very time intensive. What we found here at the top there, we've got time on device, that's the vertical axis, and we've ordered the participants by time. What's interesting here is that if you look at the addicted individuals, so they're their yellow bars, you see them kind of reasonably well scattered along the tail of this distribution here. They're not really bunched in the head. And what this kind of reaffirmed to us was that there's now, it's now the case that smartphone usage is just so ubiquitous and so flexible that really time on device isn't necessarily a good proxy for smartphone addiction. However, if we take the same sample and we reorder the participants by the volume of interaction events, so how much active usage they've got in terms of tapping the screen, you can see there kind of just by sight that you've got a much greater bunching of the yellow bars representing addicted participants in the head of the distribution. So we found that, so one of the findings was we've actually got to be really careful about how we interpret usage on smartphones because of the number of different ways that smartphones can be used these days. So yeah, that was, that's also so represented in this plot here. So daily number of smartphone user interaction events is across the bottom. Time on the smartphone is vertical there, but you can see a much greater range. You can see a significant range on the X direction there, which represents the volume of interaction events. Also worth noting, just very quickly, the way in which Android actually represents individual events on the device is really interesting. When you scroll on the screen, that creates lots and lots of these tiny little events, scroll events. So you end up in the data potentially having like a big stack of scroll events relative to, say, writing events or other events. So just wrapping this together, one of the findings that's come out of this that we've been interested in is around the smartphone addiction survey that we undertook at the beginning of the study. And in particular, we found correlations between smartphone addiction and lifestyle apps. So this is using the Google definition, the Play Store definition of lifestyle, which is a little bit variable, but particularly for female users. And the other key finding from the correlation with addiction is that not unexpectedly, we found correlations between social apps and high levels social app interaction and smartphone addiction. But what we didn't quite expect was the strength of the correlation that was coming out for Snapchat relative to the other smartphone apps. We've got to remember that this is kind of an exploratory study. It's a small study. So we do have to bear that in mind. But when we went to explore Snapchat and the way that it's designed relative to other social media, well, you know, we did begin to question whether there was a stronger pathway for Snapchat relative to other social media platforms due to the gamification that's involved in there. So, for example, the use of streaks, the idea that individuals are kind of incentivized to come back on a daily basis and repeatedly visit the app. So these are sort of early stage findings, but very, very interesting and raised many more questions than answers. So very quickly, finally, what I'd like to just touch upon is a final piece of work that we've recently considered about the similarity between our usage on smartphones. And you know, as I said at the introduction, at a very high level, we are very similar now in the way in which we're using smartphones. So sessions and time on device, for example, give some indications that we're all using the device an awful lot. But we wanted to take this a little stage further and explore if there was anything at a deeper level that represented commonality in the way in which we use smartphones. And observing the way in which people use smartphones, you know, if you think about how you go on the phone yourself, it's probably highly likely you open the phone, you enter a particular app, and then you may hop to a number of other particular apps before you exit the phone. So you might have a little path through apps that you hold on your phone, and that might be called smartphone surfing. The idea you go on there and you have a little tour of apps, or you may just go on for one app. You can represent this as a network. So here there's 4 apps. You might go from one to the other to another, so on and so forth. And if you keep repeating usage of the smartphone, you can build up a network over time that represents the paths that you take between apps. What we decided to do was to move away from looking at the particular apps that individuals might have on phones. There are some that are common, but there is also diversity that we found in terms of the different apps that people were interacting with on their smartphone. And to just remove the apps and study the structure that provided us with the surfing phenomenon that I was just speaking about. So the unlabeled, we can transform the labeled network on the left to the unlabeled one on the right. So we get some representation for each individual user that we can start to compare in more detail. So we built these, we called them app switch networks. We built these app switch networks for all the individuals that we were participating in the study, and used them as a basis for further analysis. And what we started to unpick was that as soon as we started ignoring the apps, the particular apps and the number of edges, and we moved to normalized statistics. So when we started considering the density of the graphs, the extent that there was reciprocity, so ping-ponging between particular apps, so on and so forth, we found there that we had very low standard deviations occurring relative to the mean, which gave us kind of an instinct that actually underneath all our scattered usage, we may be quite similar in terms of the app switch networks that we actually generate. And indeed, further inspection, we found when we started examining the networks, we could see small world characteristics in the app switch networks. So the idea that despite all the different apps you might have on the phone, there's a very short switching path on average between any pair of apps on your phone. So taking this a step further, we did further analysis and found that the app switch networks were falling into a class of networks represented by truncated power laws. And that was basically a very rapid drop-off and long tail in popularity. What this means is quite interesting in terms of how we kind of balance smartphone usage on a cognitive basis. We don't tend to keep a really equal, similarly popular pool of apps. We have a key app that is the most popular, and then there's a rapid drop-off in popularity beyond that point. So it leads us to believe we've kind of got a hub and spoke model going on where we've got highly popular apps, and from those highly popular apps, we switch to and from lots of relatively unpopular apps. So really interesting, potentially an insight into how we might navigate and use our own memory in conjunction with that of the phone. And there's a write-up that's recently been published on the analysis that we did and the findings in more detail. So just to conclude, I think it's fair to say we're at the beginning of the journey with smartphones, and my own personal belief is that they give us a really strong opportunity to understand human behavior just because of the intimate relationship that we have with the smartphone. You know, you carry the device around more than your partner, more than time with your partner. You know, it's there all the time, following you around in life, and we've just got really heavy usage these days. And a point there, I think going forward, a lot of the literature really does need to start to understand and segregate active and passive usage. And we should also not underestimate the types of insights that we might be able to make going forward. These might be social, physical, cognitive as well. And at one level, we're using them as a proxy for the user, but also they're giving us sort of feedback on ourselves as a species and how we function in terms of collective intelligence. So thank you very much indeed for listening. I hope that was of some interest to you, and on behalf of my co-authors as well. Thank you very much indeed.